Okay, our topic was city and state government reform.
Guys, sit down, please.
Okay, so the population during the late 1800s to early 1900s. So from the late 1800s to early 1900s, the number of immigrants has risen immensely. So if you look at the chart over here, the blue line is the number of immigrants over time, and the green one is the immigrants as a percentage of the U.S. population. So starting from around 1850 to 1860, it's around 5 million, but by the early 1900s, it goes to around 15 million. So the number of immigrants has increased by like triple the amount.
Then so basically we learned that after like the Civil War and then I think progressed, like corruption started to happen, and that became like one of the main issue of that era. And then what the like reforms in politics try to solve is that to eliminate the corrupted politics by giving people a chance, and then obviously boss tweed corruption in the big corporates and big fortunes, you know. And then I guess like one of our first slides said, milk crackers were able to exploit the fact that there were big hands that were taking over our economics. So the question becomes whether like you give a effective government with people who actually know how to run it, and like the people's government. Like the people might not be able to elect the right people, but in this case, we chose to give the hand to people. We choose to implement like direct democracy in a way to push out the corruptedness. So we go on, and then I guess encourage. So the whole plan was to encourage like people to draw into the whole political system, to be aware and acknowledge, oh, there are these kind of people, and then we wanted the new people into the new political grounds to obviously vote for honest, uncorrupted politicians.
Also, it has to be a government by the people, not just for the people.
So there were two main, I guess, aim for our progressive era in the political grounds. So the one big thing was voter participation. Obviously, we want people to be able to vote and actually know what's going on. And then following that, the legislative reforms, which all led to like legitimate law being changed.
Okay, so part of the voter participation was the Australian ballot, which was also known as the secret ballot. It was a system of voting in which voters marked choices in privacy on a systematic ballot, and it was printed and distributed by the government. And the voting boxes required to be like certain dimensions and had to be closed. The only opening was like a little slit at the top, so you could put in your vote. The containers were examined before the poll begins, and it cannot be opened again until they count the votes. And the voter marks the ballot in like a secret area, and it is inserted after the voter's right is verified. Also, it was called the Australian ballot because it began in Victoria and South Australia. They were the first states to introduce the secrecy of the ballot. And the system spread to Europe and the United States to meet the growing public and parliamentary demand for protection for the voters. And the widespread adoption was around the early 1900s. And after the system of voting, the election officials were worried about the large number of immigrants and how there would be a lot of fraud in when they were voting. So they decided to use the Australian ballot to prevent frauds. And the secret ballot used symbols, so it would be easier.
And then with ongoing with the whole effort to make a new voting system, another system was direct elections. So people were able to directly vote on the senators. I guess that's one big thing. And the other one is direct primaries. So what direct primaries allowed to do is more than like being like this party versus that party, like populist versus anything other, like it divided another like branch within all that, like it became candidate central. So like on with the like competition between just like each parties, it became another competition within the parties, intra competition as well. So it obviously made each so it became candidate central, obviously, the whole voting system, and then each candidate started having like its own like distinct campaign. It became more individualistic than like the whole group system. And then obviously the direct election gave like a really, I guess, almost direct way for people to actually represent it. And I think it's like most representative of like a true democracy. So giving people practical control over like our government.
So initiative, referendum, recall, are all ways for citizens to have more of a say in the legislative part of the government. And these mainly happen because the state legislatures are very corrupted, because all the city bosses are bribing the officials. So the initiative is a way to give power to voters, and they can just propose a bill by themselves instead of having the senators do it. And the referendum it appears directly on the ballot for voters to vote, and they can propose laws or like changes made to the state legislature. And recall is just ways of removing corrupted officials that people represent. So, two different parts of the initiative, the direct and indirect. So the direct one is the proposal go direct on the ballot. You can just vote like yes or no. It's really simple. And the indirect one are the proposals, they go to the legislature first, and depending on the states, it goes on the ballot, it gets rejected, or ignored, or if the legislature just agrees on it, then you just, yeah. And depending on the states, really different. Like no states have the same like initiative forms. So some states may have, they go on the ballot if they reject it, and some states may not. So it's really different. And the legislative referendum is required when changes are being made to the state constitution or tax. And the popular one is when the voters decide if the law should be ratified or existing law should be.
So after like adding on to Tim, what's interesting about that is not only like the people can now actually like get their own representatives up in the government, they could also like be like a direct influence on the way laws would be implemented. So if there wasn't a law, I could like I guess propose it, and then if a law seems like inconsiderate or something's wrong, I could give my own opinion to that as well.
Okay, so the 16th Amendment was dealing with the income tax. It was passed by Congress on July 2nd, 1909, and it was ratified on February 3rd, 1913. During the Civil War, Congress created the Revenue Act of 1861, and the Revenue Act was a tax on personal incomes to help pay war expenses, but it was repealed 10 years later. In 1894, Congress created the flat rate federal income tax, and that it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court the following year because it was a direct tax that was not distributed proportionally according to the population of each state. And this 16th Amendment was part of the populist program. The ratification in 1913 removed the Supreme Court claim by allowing the federal government to tax income of individuals without the regard to the population of each state. And the 17th Amendment, it dealt with the senatorial elections. It was passed by Congress on May 13th, 1912, and ratified on April 8th, 1913. In the late 19th century, some states were like were like stuck over the election of senators, and sometimes there were like vacancies for the senatorial position. And the progressive response was the Oregon system, but it was ineffective as proven in the 1912 election because the Illinois senator had a lot of like briberies and corruptions during that election. A race rider was when the state governments had like complete control over the senatorial election. So the 17th Amendment was passed to get rid of the bribery and corruption when people were voting, and for the senatorial elections to be like fair and just. And the specific 17th Amendment, it's kind of long, so I'll like paraphrase it for you. So the Senate of the United States has to be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people, and they were in position for 6 years, and each senator would have 1 vote. And if there were any vacancies, the executive authority could fill in the vacancy with a temporary person, and the amendment could not affect the election of the senator to make it like unfair or unjust by bribery and corruption again. Okay, the 18th and 19th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of liquor, but it did not prohibit the purchase or the consumption of alcohol. For the first time in history, there was a time limit for the ratification for the amendment to be included. I believe it was 7 years. It was after 1 year, actually, that the amendment had for the time limit of the amendment. It was proposed by Congress on December 18, 1917. It was ratified on January 16, 1919, and it went into effect on January 16, 1920. The Volstead Act, it prohibited intoxicating beverages, regulate manufacture, production, use, and sale of alcohol for others other than beverage purposes, and promote its use in scientific research. The Volstead Act was named after Congressman Andrew J. Volstead, who chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee. There was an increase in violence and murder between small businesses and criminal gangs, bribery between bootleggers and moonshiners, and police, and heavy and abusive drinking, because the 18th Amendment had a lot of bootleg alcohol, which contained many chemicals. And there was an increase in drugs and other dangerous substances since the alcohol created by the bootleggers were very detrimental to the health of the people. And the picture over here is a little small, but I like this picture because it really shows the way people were able to avoid the 18th Amendment, because there were a lot of loopholes that people could use because the words weren't specific on what they could do, like what is the penalty or what is the quantity that was illegal, what was the quantity of the consumption that was illegal for the people. And the 19th Amendment dealt with the women's suffrage. It was proposed by Congress on June 4th, 1919, and ratified on August 18, 1920. On December 1871, the voting rights petition was sent to the Senate and the House of Representatives after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which dealt with black men were able to vote. In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the National Women's Suffrage Association, and their goals were to work to address the exploitation of child labor, along with trying to get women to have more rights. In early 1919, the House of Representatives passed the 19th Amendment, specifically in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. They were the first states to ratify the 19th Amendment. And many states were slow to ratify the amendment, but eventually all the states did ratify the 19th Amendment.